Good evening. Many times life can feel like it's just one big competition, whether it be in business and, well, a coworker got a promotion and now I've got to figure out how I can get one. My neighbor got a nice new boat, I need to get one now too. And there's the phrase or the saying that we've got to keep up with the Joneses. We've got to keep up with everyone else, and it feels like we're in constant competition with others. We want to be like everybody else. Tonight we're going to see that desire from the people of Israel as we continue our journey through the Scriptures, as we've been reading through the Bibles, reading through our Bible all the way through in a year. We see Israel express in 1 Samuel chapter 8 a desire to be like everyone else around them. Turn over there with me if you will. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Beginning in verse 4, it says, "All the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, 'Behold, you've grown old. Your sons don't walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us, like all the nations.' But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, 'Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you. For they've not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they've done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they're doing to you also. Now listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them.'" Israel expresses a desire to be like everyone else around them. They want to be just like the nations that surround them, the nations that God had driven out, the nations that didn't worship and serve the one true God. Let us be like those other nations. Now, this didn't come as any kind of surprise to God. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, this had been foretold that this was going to happen, that they were going to set up a human king over them. In Deuteronomy 17, beginning in verse 14, it says, "When you enter the land which the Lord your God gives you, and you possess it and live in it, and you say, 'I will set a king over me like all the nations who are around me,' you will surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your countrymen you shall set as king over yourselves. You may not put a foreigner over yourselves who is not your countryman. Moreover, he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall he cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. Since the Lord has said to you, 'You shall never again return that way.' He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself." God knew they were going to do this, even if it's ultimately not what he wanted. As he said there, as we read in 1 Samuel 8, "They've not rejected you, but they've rejected me," God told Samuel. And the very things that God foretold, this is what a king's going to do. The very things he said, this is what a king should not do, is the very thing that happened. If you go to 1 Kings chapter 10, we read of those very things taking place. In 1 Kings 10, beginning in verse 26, it says, "Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem, and he made cedars as plentiful as sycamore trees that are in the lowland. Also Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Cu, and the king's merchants procured them from Cu for a price. A chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, a horse for 150, and by the same means they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of the Arameans. Now Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, 'You shall not associate with them, nor shall they associate with you, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods.' Solomon held fast to these in love. He had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after many other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. They've not rejected you. They've rejected me from being king over them, God told Samuel. God had foretold this was going to happen, and whenever he said, when you set a king over you, here are all the things that you're not to do, that king is not to do, and it's all the very things that over the next few years happened. Especially we read when King Solomon took the throne. Rejected God as king, verses 7 and 8 says. They rejected the perfect king, because after all, he had taken care of every need they had. There's really no need for a human king, inasmuch as God had taken care of every need they'd had through their entire history. As they wandered in the wilderness, they had food, and their clothes didn't wear out. As they went into the land, their enemies were driven out before them. Inasmuch as they listened to God and they did what he said, he took care of them at every step of the way. He had brought them out of Egypt, provided for their needs in the wilderness, kept their clothes and shoes from wearing out, brought them into the promised land. He kept every single promise he made. Joshua 21:43-45 says that not one promise, not any of the good promises that the Lord made to his people failed. All came to pass. God had consistently taken care of his people, and he had shown them again and again and again, if they would just trust him, if they would just obey him, if they would just put their faith in him, that they would be just fine. But then we got to the book of Judges. And there arose a generation that didn't know Joshua. They didn't know the Lord. They didn't know the things that he had done. And it says over and over and over again, if you're reading, you probably saw that phrase that came up again and again. The sons of Israel, again, did evil in the sight of the Lord. That phrase came up so many times, and that theme in Judges in those days, there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes, which meant chaos, unfaithfulness. But when they called out to God, he got them out of trouble every time. Their reproachers would come in because of their own sin, because they'd chosen to turn away from the Lord. They would cry out to God, and he would send a deliverer again and again and again to take care of them. And after all that God has done throughout their history, they said, set a king over us so that we can be like the other nations. We want to be just like all the rest of them. Those nations that God said, don't be like them, we want to be like them. Put a king over us. They didn't really realize where their blessings had come from. In Isaiah chapter 1, the first 4 verses, God speaks of his people there through Isaiah about how they don't realize what they have in him. They don't realize where their blessings are coming from. They don't realize who is providing for them. Isaiah 1, beginning in verse 1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which he saw during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth. For the Lord speaks, sons I have reared and brought up, but they've revolted against me. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's manger. Even these animals know who feed them. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. They have abandoned the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They've turned away from him. They've lost sight of the blessings they have in God. They've rejected the perfect king that's always taken care of them, that's always been faithful to them, that's always been good to them, and said, we want to be like that other nation. We want to be like all these people around us. And eventually they're kings. After the nation split into northern and southern kingdoms, their kings led them into idolatry, immorality, and eventually captivity, because they turned away from God. They put their trust in a man as king rather than putting their trust in God. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, let's pick up the reading in verse 10, where a warning is given about a king. Samuel spoke the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, this will be the procedure of a king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen. They will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of fifties, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest, and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give them to his officers and his servants. He will take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He'll take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Samuel gives them a warning against the king, and the nation persists. And they search out. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, beginning in verse 20, thus Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by Lot. Brought the tribe of Benjamin near by families, and the Matrite family was taken by Lot, and Saul the son of Kish was taken. But when they looked for him, he couldn't be found. Therefore they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? The Lord said, behold, he's here. He's hiding himself in the baggage. So they ran and took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people, from his shoulders upward. Samuel said to the people, do you see whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there's no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and said, long live the king. Saul is publicly chosen as the king of Israel. God gave them, according to their desires, the perfect king. He stood head and shoulders above everybody else. He looks like a king. He looks the part. He's taller than everybody. He looks tough. This is our king. But looking the part was about the best that he would be able to do. Because you see, they were really more interested in looking like the other nations at this point than in following after God. They had demanded a king, and it worked out much like their demand for meat in the wilderness. You remember when you read about that, they complained, we won't meat, and God said, okay, I'm going to give you meat, but I'm going to give you a whole lot of it until you're so sick of it, it comes out your noses. God gave them a king. He gave them what they wanted. And you remember whenever God gave them that quail that they had asked for and complained and fussed about, some died in the plague. God gave them what they wanted here. A king that would act presumptuously. A king that would offer burnt offerings instead of waiting for the proper person to arrive to offer them. A king who would be disobedient to the word of the Lord. A king who in 1 Samuel 14 and verse 24 says, the men of Israel were hard pressed on that day, for Saul put the people under an oath, saying, cursed be the man who eats food before evening, until I have avenged myself of my enemies. So none of the people tasted food. And it ended up being a really foolish order that he gave, because whenever the people were finally able to eat, they ate the meat with the blood still in it. Saul gave an order that caused the people to sin. Finally, when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 15, Samuel told Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. Listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself up against us on the way while he was coming out from Egypt. Go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. Don't spare him, but put to death both man, woman, child, and infant, ox and sheep and camel and donkey. Go wipe them out. But Saul thinks, I think I've got a better idea. We're going to hold some of the sheep. We're going to hold some of the animals. When Samuel arrives, Saul comes out and he's all excited. I've carried out the command of the Lord. And so Samuel asks him, then why do I hear sheep? Why am I hearing all these animals? You were told to wipe them out completely. Don't leave anything breathing. Why am I hearing animals? If you've carried out the command of the Lord, then I shouldn't be hearing this. And then you get to verses 22 and 23 of 1 Samuel 15, where it says, Samuel said to him, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. God gave them the king they wanted. He was ultimately disobedient. They wanted to be like all the other nations around them. Give us a king who will go before us. Give us a king that we can look to. Give us a king so that we can be just like everybody else. It's kind of that same justification that we use today to get away with something, or to make the point that something that we know we shouldn't be doing really may not be that big of a deal. Well, everybody else was doing it. That still doesn't make it right. You see, just as Israel was told not to be like everyone else around them, so are we. We're told don't be like everyone else around you, because God's called us to a higher purpose. He's called us to be holy. He's called us to be His people, His holy nation of people. And He's seated the perfect King on the throne over us. In Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 29, we read about the King that God has set over us. The one that we look to, that we obey. The one that can save. Acts 2:29, brethren, I may confidently say to you regarding the patriarch David that he both died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. And so because he was a prophet and knew that God had sworn to him with an oath to seat one of his descendants on his throne, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, having been exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he has now poured forth this which you see and hear. For it was not David who ascended into heaven, but he himself says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. Seated on the throne of David, seated at the right hand of God, we have the perfect King We're commanded not to be like the rest of the world. We're told that people will think it's strange when we don't behave in the same sinful manner that we used to. Don't be like them, God said. We are to be different. We are to be God's holy people. We're not to be like those around us that have styles. Oh, the argument's made by many, but it's more fun. They also are still in their sins. God tells us what He tells us because it's what's best for us. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 to 16, God gives us a standard to live by that is different from the rest of the world. He says, "Therefore, prepare your minds for action, keep sober in spirit, fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves in all your behavior. Because it's written, you shall be holy, for I am holy." And that idea is to be upright, to be pure, to be sinless. God has set us apart as His own people. You're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. He set us apart as His own people. In order that we be different than what's around us. Pilate asked Jesus, "So you are a king?" And Jesus told him, "For this purpose I was born. My kingdom is not of this world." He is our king. He's the one that we look to. And we're called by our king to be different from the rest of the world. You know, Israel wanted to be just like everyone around them. And you know, that's something that's really tempting for us sometimes. I want to be just like everyone around us, to be like our neighbors, to be like the people that are not God's people, that have not chosen to follow after Jesus. It's tempting. But it didn't work out too well for Israel. If we try to blend in with and be just like the rest of the world, it ultimately won't work out too well for us either. Everyone else who's doing it is not a valid excuse with the Lord. He calls us to be holy, to follow in the steps of Jesus. The one who says he abides in Him ought himself to walk in the same way that He walked. 1 John chapter 2 and verse 6. Who are we trying to be like? Who do we imitate? Who's our role model? God calls us to follow after Jesus, to listen to Him, to follow in His steps. Maybe you need to make a decision tonight to come back to following in His steps if you've wandered away. Or if you've never obeyed the gospel, maybe you'd like to make the decision to begin following Him tonight, to leave here as a child of God. You can do that by making the decision to be united with Him in the waters of baptism. If we can help you in some way, would you come while we stand and while we sing?